Today we are meeting James Fadiman. James Fadiman is one of the pioneers of transpersonal psychology. He, together with his colleague Robert Frager, has founded the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology in Palo Alto, California. This institute was the first institution of higher education in the field of transpersonal psychology and is still a sample of the transpersonal education in the world. But now it has changed its name and now it is called the University Sophia. James Fadiman is widely known for his written collaboration with Robert Frager, Personality and Personal Growth, the book that was translated into all main languages of the world. In this voluminous book, stunning deep panorama of inner spaces and scientific ways of understanding them is given. Scientific ways of the school's Western psychology and the main spiritual traditions. This conversation was recorded in the house of James Fadiman in California, and we touched a lot of important topics connected to transpersonal psychology. We were talking about world spiritual traditions, about the importance of investigation and learning about them and understanding them. James told a wonderful story about the way the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology was created and about the way they came to the innovative form of education through experiences. So please meet James Fadiman.
In my world, there's only states of consciousness, and that one is not ordinary and the other not non-ordinary. We fall into one particular state of consciousness which is useful, but it's a very small part of consciousness.
A kind of bad custom.
Well, it's as if on the highway you stay in only one lane, not because the highway isn't very big, but because you need to control your own small part of it. But in reality, the highway is huge and has many exits, and consciousness is huge. And so we've elected to shrink it, and we've shrunk it past where it used to be. Because when we're looking at indigenous people who are still connected to nature, they are amazed at what we don't notice, what we're unaware of, how we treat dreams as if they're not part of your living experience, how we treat even sleep as if you're not conscious, as if the brain somehow is in some other room doing something else. All of this is nonsense. So
but how it happens that
how did we do that?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, where did we first make mistakes?
Yeah, maybe.
There's a very solid bit of work that's suggesting that agriculture is where we started to make a mistake. Because as soon as you had agriculture, you were setting yourself against nature. You were not saying to the animals, please, spirit of the animals, be kind enough to allow some of my people to eat some of your people. And, of course, I know that some days some of your people, the animals, will be eating some of my people. So it was a cooperative arrangement. And similarly, when you are living on wild plants, you have to care for the spirit of the plants so they will become visible to you. There's a wonderful way in which people find peyote. Peyote is really very difficult to see. It's a little tiny plant and it looks a lot like the dirt. But the way you find peyote is you eat a little peyote, and then the spirit of peyote says, all right, you seem like an acceptable human being. I'll show you where the peyote is. And then when you walk around, the peyote will start to glow because you are in touch with the state of consciousness of the peyote. So we're really talking a very different worldview, even than many in transpersonal are comfortable with, which is that there is a wide span of consciousnesses, and the question of how many can you be aware of and still function?
Most of us, may I interrupt you? Most of us know very well what does it mean ordinary states of consciousness we are living in. But almost nobody, maybe except some shamans, knows what does it mean peyote states of consciousness. Can you give us some example?
If you take the shamanistic worldview, which more and more I think is the correct one, is there are three worlds. There's the world of ordinary consciousness, which we see and move and work in and do many wonderful things. There's the underworld, which is not a bad place at all. Christianity has given it a very bad name, but every other
Our
system.
ancestors, yeah.
As far as we know,
Yeah,
there's a
yeah,
lot of important energies that can be found in the lower world. And then there are energies and beings and ways of thought that can be found in the upper world. And from the point of view of the upper and lower worlds, they know of the three worlds and they interpenetrate them when it is appropriate, when they are asked. What the shamans say, there are spirits who simply like to be helpful. And you think, well, how could spirits like to be helpful to human beings? And you think, well, I know human beings that like to be helpful to human beings. Why would it be different in some other realm? So that's a worldview in which there is a lot more going on at any given time. And so when people talk about a coincidence, what they're noticing is it's out of their ordinary reality. It's out of their ordinary theory of what's possible. But since it happens so often, then you have to ask, are there other forces? And let me give you just a little story, which is I was working on a book about psychedelic awareness and consciousness and things I've been doing research in. And I realized that I needed a quote from a particular person, and I knew in my bookshelf of about 80 references that that person's article was there. And that's really all I knew. And I walked over to my bookshelf and I relaxed and I pulled a book and I opened it the way one opens a telephone book or a cookbook at random. And I was not on the right page. I was one page off. Okay? And I could have thought, oh, what a smart person you are. You have all that knowledge. You simply went back into your mind to the moment when you last looked at that book, which was about 2.5 years ago, and you knew exactly where it was. And that would be the height of arrogance. On the contrary, I said to the spirits, I know you have told me that you appreciate this book being done. And I really am glad for your help. Thank you. And I took the reference and went back and did my work. Now, that's a way of looking at different worldviews. And either one is fine. But in any case, we don't lose the notion that very unusual things happen very often to almost all of us. Reality is variable. And that consciousness is the lens. Really, there's an early version of the unconscious. William James didn't have a notion of the unconscious, but he did have the notion that consciousness was like a lake. And if you've ever been on a lake in a glass-bottom boat, you can see not everything, but whatever you're over. And he said, when you think of something such as you had a friend in the 4th grade when you were about 8 years old, and you haven't thought of that person until I just asked you. Now, everyone who's listening to this, just do that. And what you'll find, almost all of you will either come up with a friend instantly, or you'll begin to have memories of your time when you were about 8 years old, which in our educational system is about 4th grade. Now, what James says is you took your boat over to that part of consciousness where the 4th grade memories were, and you looked down. And that you don't need an unconscious. You simply need a conscious which can focus where it chooses. I'm beginning to feel that may be a more useful model. Because then there again are not no non-ordinary states. There are unusual states, rare states. Just as one wouldn't say that expensive caviar is a non-ordinary food, but it's a rare food. But it exists, and no one would ever say, well, I don't believe in that, because I've not eaten it.
So, taking your examples about kind of roads we lost, in roads, first of all, for inner territory, crossing, traveling on inner territory, our modern life is very much limited by our attachments, needs, our kind of job, so to say.
Right. We have achieved, by divorcing ourselves from the natural world, we have more and more needs which must be satisfied really by mechanical objects. I need to have a lot of gasoline in my life, and I need to burn it. Now, that's not very healthy or natural, but I really can't exist particularly in California where there is no public transportation, without burning gasoline. And one can make a million examples. What we were at the early days of transpersonal is we were saying, because we were coming from psychology, and at least psychology was the study of the psyche. Now, that wasn't what we were taught. We were taught it was the study of behavior, but we all kind of knew that there was a mind. And then we began to notice who else had been studying the mind. And what we found is not only the shamans, but the great spiritual systems of the world are transpersonal psychologies. They're ways of answering the question, who are we, why are we here, where are we going? And what is in the way of living here correctly? And many of us found, for instance, that Buddhism had been dealing with psychological questions for a couple of thousand years, and not surprisingly, had done a very good job.
Oh, yeah.
And was highly sophisticated. We then looked at psychology, which was 100 years old, and a lot of it had nothing to do with human beings at all. A great deal of work has been done on mice. And so we found that it was a primitive and early, and not bad, but a very simple form of understanding consciousness. So transpersonal, much to our surprise, was extraordinarily sophisticated almost from the beginning, because we had access to very sophisticated systems.
Take your example with Buddhism. In the very beginning of this era, Vasubandhu wrote Abhidharma, and it is really an example. It isn't psychology at all, of course, but it looks, for us, it looks like psychological systems. It's describing the functioning of psyche in a territory, but in context of the path to enlightenment, the goal of Buddhism.
So what transpersonal really did is say, of course it's psychology. Is it the study of the mind? And is it also the study of what the mind can do? So for instance, parapsychology, again a very strange term, which says certain things, science has said this doesn't exist. And it exists. Well, what do we do? Well, we can either say the people who say it exists are bad people and let's hurt them. Or we can say maybe psychology needs to open up a little bit. And that's happening. Now, the model is physics. Physics is wonderful. They're very clear that things are absolutely the way they are, unless there's one little tiny bit of evidence that says they're not. And then all the physicists say, darn it, I really liked the old theory. And the new one is much more complicated and difficult. But since it's true, I'm going to go over there. Transpersonal psychology has made, is as good as physics. And conventional psychology is still very caught in saying, let's stay with a simpler system. Let's stay with a safer system. Let's stay with a system which excludes a huge amount of human experience. I ask people, would you go to a psychotherapist who says, talk about anything you wish, but nothing sexual? And you think, that's insane. Everybody has something sexual in their background. Well, I think the same if I went to a psychologist and he said, talk about anything you want, but nothing spiritual. And I say, wait a moment, wait a moment. That's really like saying, let's clap our hands together, but you only get to use one hand.
Yeah, in a sense, we can define transpersonal psychology as primordial psychology, or psychology before psychology. Yeah, since
it really is
somehow
psychology.
We had to manage, we as human people had to manage about inner territory, inner journeys, and to understand how everything is functioning, and also to find the way to better functioning and finally to freedom.
Well, I think it's a wonderful way of defining it. The transpersonal is, I usually define it as a full psychology, meaning any part of human experience has to be looked at. But I think what you're saying is because we have that larger vision, we now can include all the pre-psychologies. And as I say, the wonderful thing is they're very sophisticated. If you go down to Peru and you talk with a curandero or a ayahuasquero, you're dealing with someone whose knowledge of how plants and humans interact is simply vaster and more sophisticated than anything we now have awareness of. And so we're looking at, again, here's another older pre-psychology, but it's one particularly aware of the relationship between really what we would now call in our world psychopharmacology. So there's the wonderful thing about transpersonal is it isn't afraid to take on a new area and to say, I don't know what's going on here, I don't necessarily understand it, but probably personal experience would be as good a way of exploring it as watching other people do it. You know, it's a little bit as if you watch other people eat. Yeah. You will learn a lot about chewing and cutting and maybe even about smells and densities, but you won't know much about food.
Yeah, exactly, absolutely.
So I love my academic brothers and sisters, but it's hard for me not to have compassion for them rather than just appreciate them. And I worked with Assagioli, who developed what was called psychosynthesis. And that was supposed to be after psychoanalysis, taking things apart, synthesis, putting them together. And of course, Assagioli said there's a higher self. And what he said is, don't teach people the theory. And I said, but it's your theory. And he said, give them exercises, give them practices, give them experience. The ones who benefit from a particular experience, and he had several hundred that he could pick from, he said, they will come back to you and say, can you tell me more about this? And those are the people who you can say, sure, there happens to be a theory. And I love that.
Yeah, this is great. So you gave two different perspectives. One perspective is connected with a kind of primordial initial vision of the whole full spectrum of human experiences, full spectrum of different states.
Right.
And another spectrum is connected with our limited worldview, kind of started from agriculture, Western civilizations, which are attached to particular a limited set of stuff, limited in vision. And so as far as I understand, the very idea of non-ordinary states, altered states, high states is generated inside this limited worldview.
Right. If you start from the kind of agriculture view, which is it's us against nature. Now you've already eliminated a huge amount of consciousness. And then you say, well, I want to make sense of the world inside this limited view. Well, now and then, although I try very hard, I have non-ordinary experiences outside my limited worldview. I leave my little village, I go back into the forest. And the spirits speak to me, and I come back and I say, the spirit spoke to me, and my agriculture friends say, no, they didn't. And you think, what do you do with that? Well, okay, they did, but it was in a non-ordinary state. And then your friends say, okay, you can have lunch with us again. Because you're admitting that you're still inside the camp of limited consciousness. And those of us who are academics, and I've done a lot of my work has been consulting with industry, they don't actually ask much about my background. They do ask, can you help us with a given problem? And if I may have a slightly larger worldview, they don't care. One of the reasons I like business is they say, why don't you tell us about results? And in a sense, it's America doesn't have many virtues left, just as a country and as a political entity. But we have the notion that the practical is the core of what one does.
This was Lenin said, the practice is criteria for truth.
That's wonderful. And I sometimes feel when I'm much more with my European and Russian friends that the love of theory, the love of theory construction is much more developed. And that I admit even among my American friends who like theory, I tend to go into the other room and make myself a cup of tea. Because what I know is theory is it's like an art form. And I had an experience. I was lying on a hillside having ingested a plant, and I had a realization of how much I now understood about everything. And there was a room, and it had nothing but empty blackboards. And I had chalk. And I was filling these blackboards with my wisdom. And I couldn't have been happier. And I filled blackboard after blackboard with the way things really were in my high altered state. And then a being entered the room, a very high being, which was God or a spirit or part of my consciousness, but it was a lot more than I was. And it looked around the room.
Then you permit you to be identified with.
Yeah, and it didn't feel like me. And it looked at all these blackboards of my wisdom, of my understanding of the universe, and it said, this is just wonderful. And my little ego got bigger and bigger, and then it started erasing all the boards.
Wow.
And I thought, why are you erasing my lovely set of theories? And it basically said, that was wonderful fun. Do another one. And so since that time, I take my theories more as art forms. There's a wonderful kind of art which both the Tibetans and the American Indians do, which is sand painting. And sand painting is a very serious, elaborate art form, takes a lot of effort. And at the end of it, you take a broom and you go, and it's gone.
And the meaning of this ceremony not to be attached to any material out of stuff.
So the things that I absolutely know are true right now, I'm not sure that they're true at all. Because I look back 10 years, and again, there's a wonderful thing to do. Think of something you used to believe was absolutely true that you now know is totally not true. Oh, does that mean perhaps that all the things I now think are true, such as, remember I started by saying the three worlds, and I now think that's true. Well, maybe it's not. And so it gives me a certain flexibility, and I find when I'm in the transpersonal world that people can handle that level of flexibility. They're not, they don't say, if you take away my theory, you know, I will be less of a person. They say, if you take away my theory, I'll be very uncomfortable for a while I try and reconstruct reality at this age. And let me give you just one example, because I know people really are saying, well, but my theory is really okay, and the rest of you people out here, I understand what he's saying. Do you remember when you were about 10 to 15 years old, somewhere in there, you had a belief that if you put your tongue in someone else's mouth, it was disgusting. And you may have even had some evidence. But at some point, you developed a new theory. That it wasn't so bad. And the old theory is still present. You can still get back in memory. But you notice that you simply had new evidence, and you therefore developed a new theory.
Absolutely.
And the old theory wasn't wrong, it was simply age-dated. It was for a younger person.
It was limited,
So I'm not sure that that ever stops.
I'm not sure either. So let's go back to the situation of ordinary person living in this cage of perception and so-called matrix. And so who was happy enough to find that besides ordinary states of consciousness, that there is a whole set of so-called non-ordinary higher states of consciousness.
Ah, right. See, that's wonderful, because that's the practical question. There's a song.
What is the meaning for him of all this spectrum?
Well, there's a
which are not his spectrum.
There's a song in an English song from World War I, and it goes, how are you going to keep them down on the farm once they have seen Paris? And this was World War I soldiers from rural United States who'd never been anywhere. And they come to Europe and they see Paris.
So does it mean that...
and they then go back to this...
are irreversible.
Right, exactly. Our hope is that learning is irreversible. That's the real hope of any of us who teach anything.
So if you, for example, learn how to drive bicycle, you never forgot.
Right.
If you learn how to speak, you never forgot this level.
And once you have been in altered states, higher states, different states, you remember that you were in them, like the soldier who remembers Paris. And your world becomes more difficult. You know, when you're saying, how do you survive? Well, one way is you find companions. And most of the spiritual traditions talk about finding companions. Finding someone else who at least says to you, yes, Paris is real. I was there too. And I came in a totally different way into the city, so that I saw it from the other side, and that's even more real. And then we can at least support each other. And when people say to us, there can't be anything. There can't be a giant tower made of metal 278 feet high. That's ridiculous. It's
Absolutely.
worthless, and no one would ever build such a thing because it has no use. And we're
Yeah.
Americans, and we know that.
I agree.
So there is this wonderful feeling when one has comrades, when one has people who are looking in the same direction, maybe on the same path. And that's necessary, because it's too difficult to be the only person that has these experiences. And so the very isolated saints or mystics or visionaries, they've had very difficult lives. And one of the things we can do is there are more of us who are helping each other. And something like Iritas, the fact that we can really go between countries. And we know there are people who will immediately say, yes, I know a lot of what you know, and it's all right. And yes, a lot of the culture doesn't yet understand, but we are going to help each other. And for me, that's really what it's come to. And so what I'm seeing, especially with transpersonal, as it extends into new areas, that it is much more like a good set of plants in the forest. It is nourishing itself, and by its very existence, each plant is nourishing the other.